Good morning. So today we'll finish up the odd ecology, life history, and then talk about population dynamics. You probably noticed we're one lecture behind. We'll catch up this week because I'll combine all of the two-species interactions into the lecture Wednesday. So that will be the whole gamut of two-species interactions, and hopefully we'll finish and then be back on track with food chains and food webs on Friday. And so that means I have to pick up the pace a little bit more than I have been. Let me just remind you that we were struggling to understand why Memorial Day weekend whitewater rafting is bad for these native frogs that are trying to breed and have their vulnerable eggs and weak tadpoles in the water when these floods are going by at aseasonal times of year. And then also understand why, if Sarah Kupferberg is arguing that this is going to wipe their populations out, yet the next year or two after you do this kind of recreational release, you still see frogs. Why do you still see frogs? It can't be that bad for them, right? You've seen now we have to know a bit about the life history, the natural history, the schedule of breeding, the schedule of maturing, to understand what this really means for the frog population in the long run. The fact that these adult frogs are safe and they'll live and start breeding in 3 years, but then if this persists 3 years or more, then you're going to wipe the whole population out. So that's the topic that we'll go to today. And the goal is always to understand distributions and abundances of organisms in ways that hopefully will let us predict how they're going to change as our world changes. So, you know, we're all a little bit worried about how species will redistribute themselves with climate change. And here's an example from your textbook of a very beautiful and dominant forest tree on the East Coast, the beech tree, American beeches. How many of you know the deciduous eastern forest and know the beech trees? They're really spectacular, wonderful trees. And they have a very broad range now, the orange, but if the climate warms on average about 4.5 degrees centigrade in 100 years, then they'll be extirpated from all but the New England, the southern New England, Michigan part of their U.S. range, and they'll move up into southern Canada. So you see the predicted range. So the only place that they'll still persist where they've been historically now in our lives will be where it's hatched. Then if you get 2 degrees warming more over the next century, we'll lose beaches from all of the eastern U.S. except for Maine, and they'll move into Canada. Now, this is a prediction that's just based on the physiology of the tree. It's not considering anything else, just what are the temperature and moisture tolerances of the tree. Perhaps, I hope they're considering the life history bottlenecks of the tree, which might be the very young, vulnerable seedlings. But that's all that's going on there. And these predictions, you'll see them in the papers, are what we call physiological climate envelopes, or climate envelopes. They don't have any ecology in them at all. Let me give you another example that will make us use life history thinking that's a little bit more complicated, has a little bit more ecological reality. So there are two fish that are also native to the Midwestern and the eastern part of the U.S., and they get into southern Canada a little bit now. They're warm water fish. One of them's the bass. They've been introduced into California too. They don't belong here, but they're quite common in many of our more sluggish rivers. And they're popular sports fish. Both of them are very good eating. So the current range, for example, of the bass up there at the top is the shaded area on this map. This map isn't in your book, but it is posted on the PowerPoints. So the current range is that shadowy area, and then the dotted line, which I'll bring in here, shows the northern boundary of their current range. And what's the bottleneck? Why aren't they moving any farther north? You remember, it's what limited the killer bees, we hope, is that they're too small, their hives are too small to shiver their way through a really cold winter. It's similar for this fish, although they're not social in the way that a bee is. But the first year, eggs hatch in the spring, then the babies have to gain enough energy during their first summer, eating like crazy. Well, they're trying not to be eaten because everything can get their mouths around them when they're that small, so it's a very tough time. It's definitely a life history bottleneck for this species. But they have to get fat enough that first summer so that they have enough reserves to store through the winter when they're otherwise would starve. So they have to gain enough body fat, even when they're young and tiny, so they can make it through the first winter. And if they don't, the population can't persist. So that's the life history bottleneck, and it makes sense, really, when you think of how vulnerable they are at that point. And this is where there's enough summer growing season and perhaps enough productivity for them to do that. Productivity just means how much food is there in the water. So if the climate warms, then you can see that they could go up a bit further north. So that's the new distribution, would be the solid line. It's above the present dotted northern limit. It's quite a bit further north, actually. But that's their northern limit if the food in the lakes to which they'll spread is at a low level. That means that the lakes aren't fertilized. Maybe there aren't very many cottages leaking sewage into those lakes, so there's not much green phytoplankton, not much zooplankton eating that, and not much for these little fish to eat, which eat zooplankton and bugs, and they're predatory fish. But if we had a combination of climate change and densification, more dense human populations in Canada, you know, all of the Californians that don't like the climate of Tijuana are going to be moving up to the north, right, and buying lakefront property in Canada. So if that happens, and then our sewage goes in, fertilizes the lakes, the bass might even be better off because their northern limit would stretch a bit further to the north if there's higher food. Because remember, what's the mechanism that limits that recruitment and the persistence of the population? The mechanism is the little guys have to get enough food that first summer to have enough fat to live on through the winter. So if the lakes are richer, they can do that, and they can move a bit further north. So you see, here's an interaction of not only the physiology and temperature tolerance of this fish, but how it might interact with ecology, including human ecology and water quality issues. And here's the same sort of prediction for the perch. The perch has a slightly different physiology. It's a different species than the bass. And so the physiology of how much energy it needs and how much energy it's likely to be able to acquire sets its current northern range here, and actually a little bit north, I think it looks like, of the bass. And then here's the low food and the high food prediction. Same sort of argument for a different species. So this is an interesting and more complete way to think about ecology, but later when we talk about food webs, you'll see that some of the ecological predictions we make have to go way beyond thinking about just one species or one species and its food. The predictions may depend on what the enemies or the competitors of the species do that will come back to bite them in some sort of indirect way through a web of interactions. So we'll talk about that later. The meadow wetting experiment that I've given you as an example of how you do experiments will be the example we'll use in talking about species interactions and making climate change predictions. But that will come after we've finished with thinking about the dynamics of single species, which is our emphasis today, is how do we use what we know about life history to make more quantitative predictions of whether species will persist or increase, maybe grow exponentially for a while, or die out. And so that gets us to away from just the level of thinking about individual organisms and to the study of populations, where on the second line, the definition of populations we'll use is it's just a group of potentially interbreeding individuals. That means taxonomically they should be the same species and they have to be able to get together, co-occur in time and space. So here's a population of saguaro cacti, and you can see they have some properties that we wouldn't think of if we were just focused on one individual. They have properties like they have a certain density. There's a certain number of saguaro per area of desert here. And they have size structures, proportions of little versus larger individuals. So that's a population property that is sometimes of interest. They have proportions of older versus young cacti. They have a sex ratio of, if they're dioecious, different sexes, then there would be maybe a 50-50 sex ratio if they're like us, roughly, or many species, but it may be different if there are different schedules of death, for example, between males and females. And so what will affect the numbers of the saguaro through time, the saguaro cacti? What will affect the numbers of a bird population in a park, in Tilden Park, for example, around here through time? Just remember this nice BIDE equation. You can remember BIDE, births plus immigration minus deaths minus emigration gives us the change in the numbers of a population in some circumscribed space or habitat. So the cartoon in your book has births in the nest and then some immigrants coming in, and those are green arrows. They're both making the population grow. But then there are losses. If birds emigrate, they might migrate away seasonally. And then there are deaths, of course. So what's the schedule of these various events? Does that schedule change depending on how old or how big the bird is or how dense the population is? Those things do matter, and they give us models that have been used actually for a very long time to predict populations. The field of, I should go back and have you look at this definition of demography, how the vital rates, that's birth, death, growth, migration of individuals affects the structures and dynamics of populations. This, of course, has been well studied in the actuarial industry because of life insurance policies or insurance that calculates the probability of death for certain types of individuals, human individuals. And we can use those sorts of equations in ecology also. Now, dispersion is used in a variety of ways in normal English, but we restrict its meaning in ecology to this more narrow definition, which is dispersion will mean the pattern of distributions of individuals in space. So it's a snapshot picture of individuals. And if those saguaro cacti were evenly spaced with a lot of distance between each individual, we'd call that an even or a uniform dispersion pattern. If they were clumped together and fish in a school, for example, have some advantage, they can dive into the middle of the school and hope that somebody on the periphery is the one that gets picked off by the shark. So there's a bit of a selfish herd reason sometimes for clumped distributions. Or it could be that they're just favorable places to be where there's more food or better conditions. And so organisms might be clumped because their environment has some factor that's also clumped. But that's, the individuals has a higher probability of being close to a conspecific than far from one would be a clump distribution. But if the occurrence of an individual in XY space here projected, say, over this forest, if the occurrence of a given species, like these white species, has an equal probability that any point could have that species. So it's a rigorous definition. A random distribution means that if you made a small tree-sized grid, that every point would be equally likely or to have an individual or not to have an individual. Then that's a random distribution. And we can test these with certain formulae that you'll learn if you take methods courses in ecology. But you can recognize what they mean, and it's important to understand the mechanisms that produce them. And one mechanism, what's going on with these gannets? These are breeding seabirds, and what kind of distribution do they have? Anybody? Uniform. Why? Do you see, how many age classes of gannets do you see here? It may be a little hard to see, but they're chicks. There's a baby. There's a baby. There's a baby. Another one. And so a peck apart. if you look at the distance between there, it's just a little bit too far for this parent who might prefer that its chick be the only one in the world to get all the resources. But this parent can't reach that chick, that parent can't reach that chick. So they're evenly distributed, even though on a larger scale they'd be clumped because perhaps there's only one little desert island where they can breed safe from terrestrial predators out in the ocean. So the dispersion of organisms affects the density that they experience, and it's driven by factors that affect their vital rates. Whether those chicks are going to survive or not is probably critically dependent on being a peck apart in terms of not getting pecked by other colony members. And so that would be a severe example. If a gannet reached over and pecked another gannet's chick to death, that would be a very severe intraspecific interaction occurring between individuals of the same species. And density-dependent intraspecific interactions are extremely important in limiting populations. And we'll talk about that a bit later. And then next Wednesday, we'll focus on interactions that are interspecific between different species, intra-within, inter-between. Oh, by the way, you have a Greek TA who is kind enough, Mel, who is kind enough to tell me why eutrophic means very nutrified. So she said, yes, you were right, that eu in Greek means true, but it can also mean a lot of. So thanks, Mel. And so a lot of nutrients means eutrophic is a lot of nutrients, often too many for our taste, especially if you want your water to taste good. Okay, so enough etymology asides, but intra, today it's all intra for us. And now we're going to talk about how you tabulate information on all this, life and reproductive tables. These were developed for the insurance industry, but now we can use them to project populations. The summary of age or size-specific rates of survival and fecundity, progeny per individual. You know, for humans, age matters a lot, but for many species, really size matters more in terms of its probability of surviving or how many offspring it will have. Think of trees, for example, or fish. So sometimes we tabulate in terms of size. And then you can make a life table in a number of ways, but the simplest and best way is to follow a cohort of individuals. So your freshman class that entered Berkeley can be considered a cohort, but the cohort is also biologically a group of individuals that are the same age. They were born at the same time, and you follow this from their birth until they all die. Or you can make life tables that reconstruct age at the end of life, and with a lot of assumptions, those other life tables are also sometimes used. And again, we won't get into the details of that in Bio 1, but if you go on and take more ecology, you can learn how to do this. So, homage to Gary Larson once more. Makes a lot of difference how big you are. Okay, here's a life table in your book, and I was working through it this morning, and to my distress, I found that it's a little bit complicated. So don't worry about this too much. I just bring it up because it's in your book. But what life tables, and this is one for a little squirrel population that's followed a cohort that started with 337 squirrels, and so that's how many are alive at the start of life. And then this is a term that we'll define a little bit later with the abbreviation LX. That'll come up a little bit later. But 337 out of 337 are alive at the start, so that's 1.0 proportion is the proportion alive. Now here's where the complexity comes in. So I wouldn't waste too much time trying to make this math work. But what happened is for the females and the males, this year the investigators counted 122 more females and 126 more males. So their population wasn't exactly closed. It had some immigration. So if you do the math, you can see if you subtract that 122 away, then you get a survivorship without those new immigrants of about 0.386. But this is where I couldn't make the arithmetic work anymore. This would just be the proportion of individuals that are left, And even, no matter what assumptions I made about their migration, if somebody figures out what they did, let me know. Otherwise, I think this might be an arithmetic mistake or something's screwy in this number. And I'll give you another example that's much more straightforward. But this is just the proportion of individuals that were born at the start that are still alive. And because of this immigration complexity, it's a little bit screwed up in this table. But one thing to notice, and that's interesting, is that this mortality schedule is different for the females than the males. For some reason, it's higher for males. It might have something to do with the risks that males take to find females. Perhaps they have to move around more and they get picked off by hawks more. But here's the diagram from your book, where often the number of survivors here is plotted on a log scale because it goes down very abruptly. And there are fewer males after year 4 than there are females. These guys are just taking more chances. Maybe it's all the motorcyclists they're riding around or something. And so that's a life table that we classify as by, again, Roman numerals, Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3. For something like these squirrels, there's an equal probability every year that an individual will die. And birds often have this type 2 curve. So when you plot it on semi-log graphs, with this being a log axis, that equal probability translates to a straight line. And here's what ours looks like. Our type 1 curve, at least in developed countries, is that there's very little mortality until you reach the age at which we start to senesce. And then there's a lot of mortality. And then here's probably for most of life, mortality schedules are like this. So my husband, Bill, calls this the mortality schedule for gum under the bottom of your chair. What the textbook actually meant to portray here was an oyster. But we can think of this as gum. And it's also the mortality schedule for any plant, probably any marine invertebrate, probably any insect, probably any fish. Remember that poor little bass trying to make it through its first winter? There's going to be a huge amount of mortality when you're tiny, and a lot of things in the world can get their mouths around you and eat you, and you have trouble getting enough resources and getting into favorable conditions. But then you might escape in size. Say you're an oyster and you finally settle out of the plankton, form that hard shell, and just spend the rest of your life peacefully filtering plankton and organic matter out of the water. Then unless an oyster fisherman comes and catches you and pries you off, you could live to be 100 years old. And so mortality is very, very low. Same for a mighty oak tree or the big bass, the big fish in the lake. So type 1, type 2, and type 3 just show where most of the mortality occurs in the life history. And here's the reproductive table that shows that it's not only mortality that changes, of course, with age, but also how many kids you have. So here's the age of a cohort. And in their first year, they have very few offspring or no offspring. They don't breed until they're a year old. Then about 1 out of 2 squirrels breeds. And then the 2 to 3-year-old squirrels produce about 1 offspring apiece for the rest of their lives. And so here's so you get a schedule of fecundity, in this case, that increases and then stays pretty constant through the squirrel's life. And here's the example where the arithmetic actually works. So here's the one to look at for just figuring out what some of these things mean. This is a life table for a plant. It's a flower phlox. Here's another Gary Larson. This life table could also possibly describe an insect. You know, Vern, the thought of what this place is going to look like in about a week gives me the creeps. And so, of course, that's what we can project with a life table. It's what it is going to look like in a week. And here is a plant that has a rapid annual life history. It is born, sometime in the spring, and these plants are just annuals, so they die in a year. So these are days. And the numbers that survive start out with 996, and they're all alive because the interval hasn't really passed yet, so 1.0 is alive. Then if you divide 668 by 996, you will get 0.671. If you divide 190 by 996, you will get 0.191. So this is the simpler case without individuals moving in and out to just see how a life table is computed. So you could get this important number here, LX, the number surviving to age X. And X is just the proportion. Oh, that's been cut off, I'm afraid, a little bit. Okay, so, sorry, AX, number surviving to age X, LX. This is AX, the number of surviving to age X, and I'll check to see on the web that this is clear, and apologies that it's cut off on the projection here. This is LX. LX, the proportion of the original cohort alive at time X. So that's just this column here, LX. MX, it's the fecundity. So if these are females, then they don't start producing seeds in this case until they're about 300 days old. And then about 1 in 3 plants produces a seed. And then in the next interval, everybody starts reproducing. At about from 306 to 320 days old, each plant on average produces 3 progeny. And then it goes up even more. As they get older and towards the end of their life, they get up to a maximum of each plant producing about 9 progeny. Now, if we're going to try to compute what the future will look like for this plant, we just take the number of females that are actually starting to reproduce and the proportion that are alive. So the proportion, the probability that they'll make it to that time is 0.16 times 0.33 is from that age cohort we expect an addition of offspring to the next generation of 0.05 individuals. It'll take a lot more than that to replace the population. But then we're going to start to get it because in the next interval, we had 15% survive, and during that time, each of those produced 3, so we add 0.49 individuals, and then about 15% are still alive at 334 days, and they're all having 5, and so add another 0.8 probability of making it to that age times the number of daughters you produce if you do make it. So you add these all up, and the sum of the probability that you survive to age X, the proportion of the cohort that will survive that long, times the fecundity at that age, the sum of that product is this number, which we call the reproductive rate for this population. And if R sub 0 is greater than 1, the population will grow. It'll more than replace itself. If it's equal to 1, then the n of the future will equal the n of the past. And if it's less than 1, the population will die out. So you just can look at this age-specific survivorship and fecundity sum to make a computation. This is the simple case for populations to see whether they'll persist or expand or die out. This is the method that works for the simplest case where there's no overlapping generation. So we don't have grandmothers that could be producing daughters while the daughters are producing daughters and the granddaughters are producing daughters. In humans, your mother, you may have sisters that might be having babies while you're just a baby. So in humans, we do have overlapping generations, and the human math then is a bit more complicated. This is just to emphasize the growing population. The bottom line there is that this population will grow because of this basic reproductive rate being greater than 1. So when we have overlapping generations, the math is a bit more complex, and we won't deal with this, but it's treated with calculus, and we'll treat the calculus of population growth in a very, very simple way. And then if you take advanced ecology, you can learn some of the derivations for the more complex case where you have grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, all of whom might be adding at the same time to their population. But this age structure of the populations has a big effect on what populations look like, and therefore for humans what societies look like, what maybe their economics looks like, and what their future looks like. So here's the age structure of human populations that reflect different age-specific birth and death rates in Kenya and the United States and Italy. And for example, what's going on in Italy, where this is the percent of the populations that are males and females, and this is a current population in the mid-90s. But you can see that a lot of these males are gone. These guys were 20 in 1939, so they were in the war, right? So you can see bites taken out of populations. In the United States, we have a bulge, which I happen to be a proud member of. And you all know what happened then. The soldiers came back from the war, and the economy was booming. And so there were big families, lots of births at that time. So this is our baby boom. And you guys will have to deal with us when we're old and decrepit, you know, because there are fewer of you and more of us, and our survivorship's getting pretty good. But so it's the age-specific birth and death rates will affect all of our lives, and so it's worthwhile understanding these. Okay, so population growth. What's the number in the population going to look like at time t in the future? So if it's a closed population, none of that troublesome immigration and emigration, then it's just births minus deaths. Or if it's an open population, you add in the gain from immigration and the loss from emigration. And you have a rate of change that's the change in the numbers over a change in an interval of time. So in the case of that plant, how many more plants will we get after a year? Well, we might get about 2.5 more than we started with the previous year. And to do math more simply, especially when you have overlapping generations, and again, you can get the details of this in further courses, or, you know, I could recommend reading if you're interested in pursuing the details of this. But then we go from these discrete time intervals where we're considering delta t here might be a year for that annual plant, but this would be the calculus delta t, an infinitesimally small increment of time. So this is a almost instantaneous change in population over a very small time interval. And that's the rate we're going to be considering at this point. And that rate will have a gain term, the per capita birth rate, which is the number of births per number of parents per time. So per capita means per head of a parent. You count heads. Whose heads are you counting? You're counting the heads of the reproductive individuals. So that's per capita. So this is number of babies per number of parents, or maybe number of females, mothers, per time. So numbers cancels with numbers, and the units of little b, and it's very troubling that that's cut off. But this is little b, sorry, is 1 over time. It's not cut off on my screen, but it's cut off on the projected screen. Okay, so here's just an example. If you have 1,000 individuals in the population at time t, and there are 34 births, then, and you say you are making the year your time interval, then little b, this term, is 0.034, 34 divided by 1,000, and that with units per year. And let's say you have D, deaths, which is also per capita rate. So the units of deaths are the deaths in the population per the deaths of new deaths per individuals that were in the population originally per time. So these individuals and individuals cancel. Corpses, instead of babies, you have corpses versus over the original population numbers. And you're again left with units 1 over time. And so let's say we had 16 deaths in that same population of 1,000. So then the rate would be 0.016 per year, the death rate, the per capita death rate. And then our change in population number then would just simply be the per capita birth rates times the number of capitas minus the per capita death rate by the number of times the number of capitas dying. So it would be B minus D times N of T, or R to the NT. So that's the equation that would describe the rate of population growth in a closed population where R is just births minus deaths, little r. And this is the same equation here at the top now, B births minus deaths. And this little r, if that little r is positive, then you're going to have exponential increase, because you can do the math. And those of you, how many of you have recently taken calculus? So just go home and solve here for, get the solution for using this equation. Just solve and see that you don't get N of T is equal to the N times 0 times an exponential e to the RT. I don't want to take the time in class to do that. And if anybody is interested in driving that and has any trouble driving it, come see me during office hours, or I can do it for you in office hours. Basically, you just separate out these terms and you get dn over n, and that turns out to be a logarithm. You take the log of both sides and you get the exponential of the per capita rate of increase times the time interval, and that will let us project from the starting population. If we know what births minus deaths are, it will let us project the change in population. And if births are greater than deaths, so this term is greater than 0, that change will be exponential. It'll start out, it'll increase, and it'll accelerate. So these are actually the data for some elephant seals that found a new beach to haul out on. And here are the females, and they give birth to cute little sausages called wieners. Literally, the wiener is a pun. They look like little hot dogs, but they also are about to be weaned from their mothers. And so the population biologists that study this enjoy calling them wieners, and they've marked a lot of these, and they followed numbers. So when they find a new haul-out beach and establish a new population, their numbers increase rapidly over the start of the founding of the population. That can change, of course, with density. But here, if r is greater than 0, exponential increase. If r is equal to 0, then that e to the RT term is equal to 1, and that means n of t is going to equal n of 0 forever. So here's the equation, and if r is 0, then you have e to the 0, or 1, and n of t just equals n of 0, and nothing will change. And then if r is less than 0, you can have rapid die-out of the population. This sign was reversed in the, so I made a mistake and made that sign go the wrong way in the original population PowerPoint that I posted, and I found that out this morning too. So I put the corrected version on. So if you download this PowerPoint now, you'll get a corrected version. If you've already downloaded it, then watch out for the sign here. It's facing the wrong way. Okay, so elephants even elephants that have relatively late age of reproduction and only give birth to one baby at a time, they can go exponential if conditions are favorable. And of course, humans are hyper-exponential actually now. So here's our history when we're making guesses here in the graph about what Cro-Magnons were doing, modern humans, when they dispersed out of Africa and had taken over Europe and Asia. But then we get a little bit of historical records so that we know we lost about 1/3 of Europe in the Black Plague. That didn't really affect things in the long run. And once we got industrialization, and probably particularly chemical fertilizers, we'll talk about that when we talk about ecosystems, we go hyper-exponential for a while. So billions of people, 1650, 0.5 billion people on the planet, 1850, 1 billion, 1930, 2 billion. Many of the people we know were born when there were only a third as many people on the planet as there are now. 1975, 4 billion, 2000, 6 billion, and counting. So we're in the high 6 billions now. So here's another, not a Gary Larson for once, Jeff Parker, but you are here, you may not want to be here, kind of. We're projecting probably stabilizing 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 billion. It matters a lot where the population does stabilize. And one demographic point I want to make that's quite an important one is that one of the parameters in an expanding population that matters the most to the size of the population and its growth rate over time is the age at first reproduction. So I've just drawn a little dumb model here where this is a population where the mother gives birth and dies, and then two daughters give birth, but they give birth at age 1, and then they die, and they have, this woman has granddaughters and great-granddaughters, and by year 4, she has 16 granddaughters, even though she has a relatively small family size. And here's a different life history where the female has a family size that's 4 times as large, but she doesn't reproduce until her 4th year. And so what's going to happen, do the exercise at home, which you can do with abstract math if you're mathematical, or you can just graph out if you're less mathematical. Do the exercise at home to figure out what a species with this life history will look like in year 8. And what will a species with this life history, where each of these progeny will have 8 daughters. So clearly in year 8, this population will have 64. And this population will have a lot more than that. So the point is that age at first reproduction is one of the most effective ways that we can control rate of population growth. And for humanity, it's also one of the most enlightened ways. It means female education, females delaying births until they're a bit older would make a huge difference in the future of population growth on the planet. So the populations that are going to go exponential, as I believe it was Darwin once said, that even elephants, if they're not constrained, they're going to reproduce, eventually cover every surface of the earth, and then start expanding outward to space at the speed of light. Any population can do that, potentially, with this exponential growth. And so that doesn't happen. That's not what we observe. Something kicks in at higher densities that often makes population growth stabilize. So at a point like this, births are equal to deaths, or births plus immigration are equal to deaths plus emigration if it's an open population. So some ceiling is hit at a certain population density. This population density in this example is 1,500 individuals can fit into the environment, and suddenly their vital rates change in some way so that there's no more population growth. And in fact, before that happened, population growth had started to decelerate relative to the exponential growth that it was tracking at very low population densities. So this ceiling has a term that we call carrying capacity. The symbol is K. So you should remember 2 variable names, R, little r, the intrinsic rate of natural increase, and K, the carrying capacity of the ceiling, which is just this asymptote here. And this carrying capacity depends both on the environment, how many resources it has, maybe how big it is, how productive it is, how benign the climate is, how much energy organisms have to waste keeping themselves warm so they can't allocate that to reproduction. It depends on the environment, but it also depends on the organism. So organisms have different efficiencies in using resources and converting those to progeny. They have different body sizes, so you can pack more little species into an environment than more big species. So there are both biological and environmental factors that affect carrying capacity in a given environment. And I want to also make you appreciate another difference between R and K. R, we can derive R if we know births and deaths and say there's no migration. Or if we know births and deaths, we can compute little r from mechanisms, from the vital rates of individuals summed over their populations. K, we just backfit to the data. K is made of a complex of environmental and biological factors, and we usually just fit the data to K. So it's not a variable that we have a mechanism to predict. But we can explicitly study density dependence of births and deaths and figure out in a given environment where they're going to change in ways that can slow down or stop population growth. And so these are just examples of birth rates, and these are per capita, per individual birth or death rates plotted in all of these 6 graphs against population density, increasing from left to right. So you can have examples where, for example, in this lower graph, births don't change. The births are density independent. That's what that flat line, the flat red line, red is births here and blue are deaths. Oh, sorry, blue are births and reds are deaths. Sorry, reverse that. Okay, blues are, so here we have a density independent death rate. And births start out high when mother's in an uncrowded environment, and then for reasons you can readily understand, there are more of those seabirds around, so maybe it's harder to stay a peck away, or mother didn't get quite as much to eat because the other adults were competing with her for food, so she couldn't yolk up as many eggs, et cetera, or a communicable disease starts to kill some of the offspring or make the females abort. So all of these things can go wrong at high densities. And at this point, birth rates are greater than death rates, so the population will grow. Here, it'll stay stable, and here the population will shrink because birth rates are less than death rates. And so deaths can increase with density, births can decrease with density, both can happen at once, or just one or the other, but one or the other of a density-dependent response in these vital rates will calm down exponential population growth and even make the populations go negative. So the question is, how does that happen over time? Does it happen in a nice, polite, stable way, like our ideal graph, where you have exponential growth when these paramecium are sparse, and then they maybe start poisoning the environment with their own wastes or running out of food, so death rates may increase or birth rates decrease or both, and their carrying capacity evens out at about 900 individuals. If this was a territorial organism like a little trout in a stream, territoriality can also do that because the extra trout after this density, after 10 fit into the stream, the extra trout would be forced to leave because the territory holders would be dominant and just make them go elsewhere. So you could really take care of extra population with forced emigration. Sometimes, though, there's going to be a little bit of an overshoot because of time lags. So in this case of this little crustacea called Daphnia, one of the major grazers in lakes, starts out exponential, and then for a while, even when it's above the long-term carrying capacity of the environment, the births that were stored up because the mothers were eating and making eggs here, so they still have that fat reserved. They still are producing too many eggs for the environment, it turns out, so those eggs don't live at all. So the young may have a bottleneck, and there may be so much mortality in the young that when they die and the mothers finally start dying off that produce them, then there's a little bit of an overshoot. So you can have this overshoot because of lags and then oscillating around and finally come to equilibrium. Or things could just wiggle all over the map and look fairly chaotic. So I want you to just look ahead. We'll go over this more slowly next time, but look ahead. We want to distinguish between limiting factors and factors that regulate how much populations oscillate up and down around those levels. And if you look ahead in your handout, what populations do can be exactly analogized to what you do if you're driving on the freeway and you're speeding, going too fast, or you're oversteering, or you have a time lag so you get a bit distracted talking to your passenger.